The Great Transition by Nick Fuller Googins is frustrating on a spiritual level. It is a speculative science fiction novel set in a near-future Earth after a global war against climate change. The novel explores not only the radically different world that's emerged after humanity's long march to carbon neutrality, but specifically the road we traveled to get there, our transition from the brink of apocalypse to an equitable and sustainable future for all. It follows the dual POVs of Emmy, a young girl growing up in the transition's wake, and her father Larch, who witnessed the worst of the climate catastrophe with his own eyes and played a direct role in reversing it. Now, before we go any deeper, I'm going to lay my cards on the table. I'm not sure if I believe in a future for the human race. Yeah, kind of a heavy topic, but that's where we're going tonight. At this point, we are headed for the worst case scenario, and although climate change will absolutely devastate humanity, I don't share the romantic view I think a lot of us younger generations hold in assuming revolution as an inevitable consequence. In fact, the more I learn about this world and our history, the less I believe this to be accurate. If the last few years are anything to go off of, it'll probably be an opportunity for those responsible to further enrich and empower themselves at our expense. And I do believe there may come a day where their accumulated power is simply too great for any of us mere mortals to challenge. In fact, we might have even already crossed that threshold, even if we don't know it yet. Anyway, The Great Transition is a novel about how one day humanity suddenly decided to get its act together and everyone lived happily ever after. All the great institutional powers responsible for the man-made apocalypse the novel centers around fold without resistance or complication. It's a democratic socialist fairy tale, optimistic to the point of fantasy, yet also deeply confused about the utopia it uses that leeway to portray. It's also just not a great story in general, so let's break down the plot. Over a decade has passed since humanity achieved net zero carbon emissions thanks to the global ecological restoration project known as the Great Transition. Though humanity failed to mitigate many of the climate crisis's worst effects, the planet is now on the road to recovery, and a radical new social order has largely supplanted our old ways of life. Our teenage protagonist, Emmy, born after the transition, enjoys a relatively safe and comfortable upbringing compared to her parents, Larch and Christina, who both endured the crisis's worst years and played major roles in the recovery efforts. The family lives in Nook, Greenland, which is now a bustling metropolis due to climate change driving mass migration to the poles. Much of the book focuses on the family's varying perspectives and overall dynamic, which starts off rather strained. Christina is a die-hard believer in the Great Transition, a radical among radicals, deeply frustrated by compromises made during the project, as well as the populace's growing sense of complacency post-carbon neutrality. This puts her in direct opposition to Larch, who believes the transition is over, the work is done, and Christina is simply stuck in the past. Both of them view their daughter Emmy as soft, unable to empathize with her anxieties due to the sheer magnitude of what they endured at her age. Over time, Christina's conviction and, frankly, volatile personality have alienated her from her family. She and Larch constantly fight, while her callousness drives Emmy away. Her constant volunteering for overseas reclamation duty has only further exacerbated this rift. The novel begins with Christina leaving for yet another voluntary deployment on the morning of Day Zero, the holiday celebrating the anniversary of humanity first achieving carbon neutrality. Larch and Emmy go downtown for the festivities, despite Christina warning them not to. As they're checking out the parade, they hear gunshots. Several politicians and other officials at the event are assassinated, and everyone flees. When Larch and Emmy regroup back home, they question the timing of Christina's warning and suspect she might have been involved with the attacks. Their suspicion is only further reinforced when Emmy checks the news. The group responsible for the killings, an underground terrorist outfit known as the Furies, released a manifesto which Emmy swears matches her mother's writing style and mannerisms. Larch isn't so sure. Regardless, when two police officers come asking for Christina's whereabouts, he does his best not to tip them off. One of the officers hands him a business card and says to call in case anything comes up. Shortly after, two more cops arrive and claim they've never heard of the folks who just got done questioning them, but neither Larch nor the cops decide this is worth looking into. For some reason, something is going on, though they're not sure what. And since they haven't been able to contact Christina since she left, both worry she might be in danger and decide to track her down, taking a plane from Greenland to the site of her reclamation duty, New York City. That's the basic premise. Zooming out a little, the story is broken up into three different perspectives. The first is Emmy, whose POV remains in the present day throughout and revolves solely around the quest to find her mom. The second is Larch, whose perspective alternates between the present-day plot and his experiences during the climate crisis and Great Transition. The third takes the form of an in-universe school assignment written by Emmy, covering the history of the transition, complete with notes from the teacher and everything. Much of this assignment focuses on Emmy's interview with her mother, where Christina goes into detail about her own past. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to condense everything down to 3 chronological perspectives, starting with Larch. Larch grew up in Maine, watching the crisis gradually destroy the surrounding ecosystem year after year. When he was a teenager, he lost his family and pretty much his entire life to a wildfire. Afterwards, he took refuge in a public shelter where he learned to open up to the people there and become part of the community. Then, one day, the West Antarctic ice sheet collapsed, a massive watershed event in the climate crisis. Not only that, but it happened during an election year. As a result, a previously unheard-of third party called the People's Party swept the ballot box, ushering in an unprecedented suite of democratic socialist reforms alongside a nationwide mobilization to combat the climate crisis. The newly created Department of Emergency Transition recruited citizens from across the country for a host of ecological restoration and public works projects, an opportunity Larch eagerly embraced. Alongside these government projects, unions and mutual aid federations grew in strength and number. In spite of the crisis, the government managed to institute a 30-hour work week in addition to a democratically elected management structure for its workforce. However, the People's Party often diverted the Department of Emergency Transition's resources and efforts towards projects which favored the wealthy at the expense of the poor. Larch's crew, for instance, was ordered to work on a massive seawall constructed around the vacant luxury and high-value investment properties around Manhattan, which would divert even more excess floodwater to the poorer boroughs. Protests and riots broke out in response, but the People's Party refused to give in, even as a massive wave of strikes followed, which all but collapsed the old social order. This in turn inspired revolutions across the globe. In the aftermath of this largely bloodless affair, the Great Transition was ostensibly in the hands of the people. The new revolutionary government issued grant money for workers to buy out the companies they worked for, and over the years, McDonald's, PepsiCo, and other major corporations peacefully transformed into worker-owned cooperatives. Over the decades, borders dissolved, private corporations were abolished outright, and half of planet Earth was completely evacuated so that Mother Nature could heal. During that time, Larch was sent to assist with wildfires out west, where he met Christina. The two of them were already minor celebrities at that point, him for his role in a state media program about transition workers, and Christina for her prominent role in the strikes. They fell in love and eventually got married. And despite their reservations about the world and bringing a child into it, Christina gave birth to Emmy shortly after humanity's first day zero. And speaking of Christina, while Larch had a rough time growing up, it really pales in comparison to what she went through. Born in Mexico, the deadly heat waves brought on by the rising climate crisis turned their homeland inhospitable. Her family was forced to flee north alongside numerous others. They were detained at a border checkpoint in the United States, where authorities separated Christina from her relatives. She spent the next several years in a concentration camp. The guards routinely humiliated, tortured, and sexually abused prisoners under their watch, including Christina's best friend. When the People's Party took over, the Department of Emergency Transition freed all migrants detained at the border and immediately conscripted them to fight fires under threat of continued detention. Christina and other former captives were dispatched to combat forest fires without proper protective gear under corrupt and incompetent managers. Amidst rising discontent with the government, Christina and her team became famous for refusing orders to protect a row of properties owned by billionaires. She became a figurehead for the emerging strike wave and general revolutionary fervor sweeping the world. Oh God, there's a plane. After she and Larch fell in love, Christina was severely burned during a wildfire operation. Larch stayed by her side throughout the healing process, and though she eventually recovered, the scars from this incident stayed with her for life. As the Great Transition progressed, Larch's conviction waned, while Christina's remained strong as ever. Many of their arguments stemmed from his desire to settle down rather than keep fighting the good fight like her. It tore at their relationship, as the necessities of their deployment often left them separated for long periods of time. Despite eventually marrying and having a child, Christina could never fully settle into that lifestyle. Hence, she routinely disappears from her family for volunteer duty overseas and resents the fact that her husband and daughter have seemingly given up on the cause. Right, so now that we've gotten those oral histories out of the way, let's dig into the present-day plot. I saved the worst for last, so buckle up. Emmy and Larch fly to New York to track down their mother. Unfortunately, the public transit system breaks down due to a hurricane, and the two spend many chapters lounging around various terminals and interchanges along their route. Emmy runs into two fellow teenagers, Angel and Rena, who quickly begin probing for her political views. Specifically, they're trying to figure out what she thinks of the Furies. They tell Emmy about how all their various assassination targets were climate criminals or in some way responsible for the crisis. Bankers, former oil executives, and other wealthy elites who now held seats on various government councils. Though the two insist they don't believe in violence, they're both in agreement that people like that need to be punished, either because of the damage they'd do otherwise or the precedent it would set if they weren't. Over time, they manage to sway Emmy to their side. One night, Emmy slips away from her father to follow a strange-looking drone off nothing but pure animal instinct. Angel and Rena inexplicably intercept her and insist she needs to follow them to safety immediately. They say they know her mother. Even more, they tell Emmy that Christina is a Fury, and that the two of them have been working for the organization the entire time. Before Emmy can process this, the group is intercepted by another pair of fake cops who kidnap Emmy and drag her away to a safe house. There, she's interrogated. Though the impersonators still attempt to maintain their facade, it isn't long before Emmy realizes they're actually the bad guys and escapes. Shortly after, she reunites with both her parents because right after Emmy left while her dad was sleeping, Christina just so happened to find her way to Larch. She confessed her involvement with the Furies and explained her side of the situation. As a result of the assassinations, a nondescript cabal of wealthy businessmen, former elites, and others who seek to turn back the transition began targeting her and her family, the same ones who kidnapped Emmy. Before she escaped, they issued a warning stating that if any further attacks were carried out, Emmy would be killed. Christina also reveals that Larch and Emmy were tracked down because of a bug implanted in the cop's business card, which Larch just happened to carry with him the entire time. Remember? From the beginning of the book? Also, Angel and Rena were both murdered, just straight up, killed and dumped into a cold storage unit. But hey, at least the gang's back together again. In the wake of this incident, the whole family has to go underground to avoid being targeted. A new home and a new city under new names, the whole package. This isn't like witness protection, though. They do this through the Furies, only Christina still can't give up the fight. She's more than happy to help the others settle into a new life, but she wants to keep working in the shadows to exact vengeance on those responsible for the crisis. In fact, she invites them to come with her. But when Larch holds his ground, Christina ultimately decides her work with the Furies is more important, and she leaves her family behind. The story ends with Larch and Emmy building new lives in Detroit. After being kidnapped and... God, I'm such an asshole for recording this during your race. After being kidnapped and held hostage by two fake cops who killed the two people she'd been bonding with for most of the adventure, Emmy is less anxious than ever, making friends with ease and even joining a Dungeons & Dragons group. And that's the note the book ends on. So I have a lot to say, but before I get into the bigger problems of the story, I'll try to offer this book some praise. Namely, I would not be doing this for a less interesting story. As far as political commentary goes, you could do a lot worse, like a lot worse. The Great Transition is not some inert lump of commercial fiction. It is chock full of ideas, thoughts, feelings, conviction. It drips from every page, for better or for worse. This book makes lots of interesting, yet half-baked and poorly articulated points. Ultimately, I do want to see more books like this. I want them to be better books, but overall, I do appreciate that there's a space for fiction like this, and I want it to expand. I think it's important to question what the world might look like during and after the climate crisis, because it will happen, it is going to change the world, and we should be dealing with it. Figuring out what's stopping us from dealing with it and what might have to happen before that changes is a deeply fascinating discussion. so I commend Nick Fuller Googins for contributing to it. And while I am going to spend time picking apart the politics presented in this novel, there are still a lot of bold ideas which frankly surprise me to see in any traditionally published novel. Though I wish they were explored more thoroughly, I can appreciate the significance of those elements surviving to publication at all. You can also tell a lot of research was done on the climate science side of things, the various knock-on effects of the crisis, and the measures taken by transition workers to combat them. I also felt pretty grounded in the sections describing Christina and Larch's... Get away from me. I also felt pretty grounded in the sections describing Christina and Larch's early experience of the crisis. There's some real gravity to those flashbacks where the world is still quite similar to our own, just worse. The last days of business as usual before we can admit the apocalypse is upon us. All the bitter, drawn-out fights for survival against the elements. Those sections are where this novel shines brightest. Moreover, it's only by virtue of dealing with something I care so passionately about that I'm being this critical in the first place. Fundamentally, the Great Transition is utopian fiction, and specifically, it is a utopia inspired by the late, great Ursula Le Guin. This is something Googins openly admits to, and an inspiration the book wears on its sleeve. There's even a Left Hand of Darkness reference in the final pages. This is something I'll discuss in greater length later, but all this to say, if the two of us sat down, we would probably agree on most of the topics and ideas brought up in this book. I just seriously disagree with his portrayal of our path to that brighter future, and most other details surrounding it. Alright, so now that I've qualified my vitriol, let's start by digging into some minor grievances. First off, oh my god, so much of this book is pure cringe. I mean, genuinely, I spared you in the summary, but there is so much in here that makes my skin crawl. Like, our main character, Emmy, is into oldies music, which basically means she spends a significant amount of her chapters making grating pop culture references. I suspect this was done to make her seem relatable, I guess, but it's so ham-fisted and overused. It could have been charming if 90% of it was cut. Unfortunately, Emmy has too few defining features to go without, so I hope you like Britney Spears jokes. And, I can't really attach this to any greater point, but, the in-universe social media site everyone uses is called Meme Feed. I cannot overstate how much I dislike that fucking word. Another point I want to bring up revolves around Emmy's dysphagia. I didn't bring it up in the summary because it's not really relevant to the plot, but basically she has trouble swallowing solid foods. She has anxiety over choking. It's ill-defined and not thoroughly explored, nor is it even explicitly named. I've seen some people say it's a good bit of representation, but I disagree. I am categorically opposed to the way this story utilizes her condition because it's substituting a real-life pathology for a character flaw. It's not something she simply has to live with, it is a symbol for Emmy's character arc, built to be something she overcomes by the end of the narrative. In the beginning, Emmy's dysphagia is so severe that it actively interferes with her life. She bails on a skiing trip because she worries the lodge won't have proper accommodations, so she might choke on the food there. However, after surviving a terror attack, being kidnapped, losing her friends, losing her identity, and losing her mother, this condition all but disappears because she's built enough character, I guess. Honestly, the whole narrative seems like it would leave her far more psychologically damaged than fortified, but what do I know? Like, you would understand not to do this with something like OCD, right? Or a personality disorder. It wants to reinforce this coming-of-age theme, but there are so many better ways to portray personal development and maturity than growing out of a medical condition. Also, I really hate how this book is paced. The present-day plot is stretched way too thin in order to accommodate Larch's flashbacks and Christina's interviews, and when we do focus on it, everything is so passive and boring. The plot knows Emmy and Larch aren't going to find Christina, so they're not really doing anything. They never have a coherent plan to find her, they're just standing around various organs of the New York public transit system until the third act comes along so Emmy can be kidnapped and then prove herself to her parents by breaking out. Angel and Rena also feel really out of place. They're really only there to facilitate Emmy's loose character arc of opening up to people, which also happens to help cure her dysphagia. They tell Emmy information about her mother she would have learned anyway, and then immediately die. I guess they also lured Emmy out where it made sense for the kidnappers to get away with her, but that could have just as easily been facilitated by the tracking device. It's also a little weird that their deaths don't affect Emmy more long-term, especially since their friendship was pretty integral to her arc. And lastly, this book is quite moralizing. This actually has a pretty significant negative synergy with all the nonsensical politics on display throughout, because it's constantly making these calls to action. It's blunt beyond belief, even to the point where the thesis statement of the novel is directly stated via the thesis of Emmy's assignment, which her teacher underlines to point out how great a thesis it is. It's kind of ridiculous. We're told time and time again that no matter the successes of the Great Transition, it's still a tragedy that it had to happen at all. If generations past had acted differently, maybe less people would have had to suffer. And then it spends its entire length outlining an incoherent political pipe dream whose most important details are skirted around or left ambiguous, one which fails to address so many of the difficulties it would naturally encounter, it completely undercuts its own message. So let's get into that. The People's Party is an interesting organization, to say the least. They are not very well described at all, and their role within the story fluctuates wildly. When they're first introduced in Larch's flashback chapters, it happened so jarringly I immediately started taking the novel less seriously. It totally shattered my suspension of disbelief when I first read it. People were desperate. I don't know why I'm doing this. Like it's fucking pitch black out here. I can't see shit. People were Okay, just pretend. Just do it for me, alright? Just do it for me. People were fed up. The old parties had so spectacular... People were desperate, fed up. The old parties had so spectacularly failed. People who had never had a reason to vote were lining up to throw the bums out, to cast a ballot for something new. Anything. Like most, I had never heard of the People's Party. Apparently, they had been around for years, earning a steady 2 to 3% of the vote. This time, they won up and down. The People's Party made promises like all parties do. The difference was that they delivered. I mean, wow. I can't believe nobody's thought of that before. I mean, really, this is absurd. Later we learn it's also just flat out wrong, but one thing at a time. That paragraph is pretty much everything wrong with the Great Transition in a nutshell. The vast mobilization campaign against climate change portrayed in the book is only facilitated by a miraculous series of political and socioeconomic upheavals, all of which are predicated upon some staggeringly generous assumptions about the state of the world and America in specific. For instance, this book does not shy away from the reality of American concentration camps at the southern border. Christina explicitly condemns it as genocide. Racist and ethno-nationalist sentiments are clearly alive and well in this setting. Yet we're to believe the majority of Americans spontaneously abandoned the deeply entrenched, unfathomably well-financed two-party system in favor of an overtly socialist third party who ascended to power without contest? I'm sorry, but I don't buy that. I don't buy that there's no organized right-wing opposition given the lengths the book goes to establish those reactionary elements. The book points out how climate change was driving northward migration. Christina goes to great lengths to explain why she identifies specifically as a climate refugee. Yet the book never squares the circle and acknowledges how the crisis would interact with and likely bolster those ideological currents. Instead, they vanish the moment the plot needs them to. This development is almost solely responsible for getting the Great Transition going in the first place, and it's a total non-starter. Worse, the beliefs and structure of the People's Party is completely opaque. And I think that's partly by design. There's never a named president or politicians with identifiable principles, special interests, or ulterior motives. Rather, we're only given the suggestion of an amorphous populist movement whose priorities shift drastically as the story demands. They divert an extraordinary amount of money, labor, and resources towards the transition. They are deeply pro-labor. They seem to be the point of origin for a lot of truly radical left-wing organization, like the emergence of mutual aid federations alongside the massive uptick in union activity. But at some point, they become inexplicably beholden to the interests of the wealthy. The Department of Emergency Transition, created and presumably staffed exclusively by the party, begins prioritizing projects that disproportionately benefit the rich, and they don't yield even in the face of widespread strikes. It's so bizarre because this is something that could absolutely be explained, and I think the story would benefit massively. Charitably interpreted, this could be a point about the failures of electoralism, the limits of working within the system when the fundamental structures of power and influence remain unaltered. But we get zero insight into that. And I think the reason is because that would require the book to contend with the realities of these ambitions. Fact is, the people in control have and always will fight tooth and nail to protect and expand their power. Yet the party's ascent to political dominance goes totally unchallenged, and the suggestion of outside influence from the wealthy is only invited once convenient to progress the story. Why does this hugely popular pro-labor government suddenly become so obstinate as to spark a full-blown revolution? I can only assume so little detail was spared because any further information would only call attention to this inconsistency. I do have one pet theory. It's absolutely not the story's intention, but you could read the People's Party as eco-fascists. That'd be the only explanation to resolve the absence of right-wing opposition I mentioned before. They're like a social nationalist movement, or even a Never mind. Because even though they do technically free the captive migrants at the border, it's only to gang press them into fighting wildfires. Christina explains this as following in the actual real-life American tradition of forcing prisoners to fight fires. They are legally slaves, after all, but that absolutely does not hold water because all the people detained at those camps are not prisoners. They have not been convicted of anything. The fact they're forced to work in lethal conditions while being hamstrung by lack of protective gear under threat of further baseless detention is perhaps worse than what was happening before. In this light, Larch's previous comments about the party become even more baffling because that was all retrospective, right? So presumably he's aware of what his wife went through, right? I mean, I get the median voter is an idiot, but in what reality would you describe a party whose government was eventually overthrown and also pressed your wife into slave labor as one that delivered on its promises? I mean, what the fuck? That said, they're definitely not meant to be read as eco-fascists. Much of the language revolving around the party and the transition broadly is more evocative of the New Deal. America's lifting itself out of a death spiral through expansive public works, progressive policy, and mass mobilization. Only this time, instead of World War II, we're mobilizing to fight climate change. Yet the book acknowledges that, like the original New Deal, progressive policy hardly prevents an administration from doing heinous things, including the use of concentration camps. And that's a nice thematic read, but it doesn't make what surrounds it any more coherent. As a call to action, it's borderline delusional. The closest book I could compare The Great Transition to is Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, in terms of subject, not quality. Whereas The Great Transition presents a fantastical and poorly defined future wherein humanity undergoes a miraculous global revolution to defeat climate change, Ministry for the Future makes a game out of giving its premise as little leeway as possible. The opening of the book depicts a horrifying heatwave in India that kills 20 million people, and in response, the UN creates a toothless subcommittee to direct global climate policy. It's one of those books. There is a better sense of international diversity as well as geopolitical disorder. The fight against climate change develops asymmetrically, according to the specific conditions of the nations and peoples dealing with it. Not only are perspectives offered from all across the globe, but it acknowledges and even reckons with the numerous barriers to international cooperation that the Great Transition completely hand-waves. The book understands that even as countries work towards a common goal, they are ultimately only beholden to themselves. A lot of effort is dedicated to presenting solutions to climate change that align with the interests of existing power structures, rather than sweeping them all aside through a vague global revolution. By the end of the book, there is no unified solution. Earth is not a world government of the United Nations, nor has humanity evacuated to the poles. People are adapting, and new ways of life are emerging from this crisis, but they're all quite diverse, both in their outcomes and paths to those outcomes. And that's not to say it's a perfect book either. It absolutely has its brain-dead moments. It leans a bit too heavily on everybody acting in their own best interests, and it fails to reckon with the possibility of reactionary, right-wing sentiments taking hold as opposed to rational, if self-interested political action. Or just that whole chapter where Robinson narrates from the perspective of the blockchain itself and pontificates on its role in humanity's future. Absolute cringe. Kim Stanley Robinson is capable of writing cringe. Everybody is. But reading this book after reading The Great Transition was like putting on glasses for the first time. It was so refreshing to read a take on this concept that didn't shy away from the big real-world obstacles that currently impede our efforts not to destroy ourselves. It's dramatically less utopian than The Great Transition, and that's absolutely a difference of intention, but what it does present is a lot more believable, and to me, that makes for a more satisfying book. That's not to say I'd like to see those speculative elements of The Great Transition cut down. Absolutely not. I'm just frustrated that I can't believe in them, because that's what makes those elements sparkle. That's the juice for me. Or it could just be a fun story. This wasn't. I only fall back on these high-minded ideals when a book has nothing else going for it to make me discard those preferences. Unfortunately, the most interesting thing this novel has going for it are its ideas. And those ideas are messy. Like, the social revolution that occurs over the course of the Great Transition is a fairy tale. The old order makes no attempt to preserve itself, and once America gets the ball rolling, it's just assumed the rest of humanity hops on the bandwagon. This movement succeeds on such an unfathomable scale, and we are given so little insight into how that happens because the book cannot do so without causing the world it's constructed to implode. As an example, let's talk about the Furies. By day zero, we are thoroughly post-revolution. A wholly new social order has cemented itself, one which venerates ecological sustainability, mutual aid networks, and worker-owned cooperatives. I don't know why the old megacorps weren't broken up more, or even rebranded. However, it is really funny to imagine PepsiCo somehow outliving the concept of conventional nation-states with hard borders, so I guess I'll give that a pass. What I won't give a pass is the idea that this society somehow allowed anybody even remotely connected to the crisis into a democratically elected position of leadership. That even after seizing power to the extent portrayed in the book, this ecological maximalist movement, which went as far as to evacuate half of planet Earth so the biosphere could recover, somehow lacks the resources or political will to arrest the people who you'd think would be this society's most universally hated enemies. The book talks about these rogue billionaires on yachts in the Great Lakes, but why? How? Are these people seriously allowed to interface with the collectivized global economy still? The book almost makes it seem like there are still these self-sustaining enclaves of wealthy businessmen operating from the shadows, as if they've somehow retained their power even after having their assets seized and being cut off from the worker-owned global economy. I don't even know. The book alludes to figures who want to turn back the transition, but nothing about them is explained in detail, and these are known hostile forces. There's a scene in New York that shows the terminal being defended with automated turrets to protect against attacks by these climate criminals. That's how regularly it happens. They are murdering and kidnapping people on foreign soil and have infiltrated police departments. Why are the Furies taking these people on and not, the fucking military? Even weirder, they're not spoken of as these dying holdouts of the old world living on the fringes. Even long after the revolution, former climate criminals somehow maintain positions on the leadership council and apparently have enough sway that some cities have re-legalized the charter of private corporations, but where is any of this coming from? It makes no sense. I'm not sure if even Googins understands what he means when he refers to worker-owned cooperatives. Like, there's this one line from the modern-day plot. Let me read it to you. My mom wouldn't have everyone looking at her like they're looking at my dad, like he's some Mineco big shot who's never worked an hour in his life. Which, what? What does that even mean? They're talking about a worker cooperative. Who are these democratically elected oligarchs who've somehow amassed a fortune sufficient to never actually work despite the abolition of private enterprise? Likewise, the way people talk about the Furies feels deeply out of sync with the setting's implications. It's like Googins want to have a conversation about the role and necessity of political violence, but he doesn't take into account how the Great Transition and its associated social revolution would affect that conversation. Everyone in the book talks about it the same way we do today. Even after a global eco-socialist revolution, the idea of violence against these individuals is still somehow taboo. I guess that could stem from the fact they apparently hold enough influence that people are still regularly electing them to public office, but that by itself makes even less sense. If this setting is so poorly thought out. Now, if I had to guess why Googins did this, I'd say it was a product of split intentions. He clearly wanted to write a cautionary tale about how we need to remain vigilant even if we do overcome the climate crisis, because complacency risks throwing away what progress we do make. But he also wanted to show us a utopia, a picture of what the world could look like if we got our act together. Yet these motivations contradict each other. The utopia presented in The Great Transition is so uncompromising in so many ways, those cautionary elements feel more like oversights than nuances. And it sucks because there is a kernel of something truly interesting here. I think this book would be infinitely better if it committed to one path or the other. If it's a utopia, let it be a utopia. Explore how that utopia came to be and how we could possibly emulate their success. If you want to tell a story about a compromised, Pyrrhic victory against climate change, tell that story instead. Tell that story instead. Because I can absolutely imagine a world in which the powers that be ruin everything, then press the masses into deadly, back-breaking labor to restore the planet they killed, only to take credit for themselves and claim that all is fixed, even though the fundamental power structures that led to the crisis remain intact. And then everyone's living in this world which superficially embraces the culture of ecological balance without anyone really caring, like how Americans equate the defeat of Germany with the defeat of fascism as an idea, even though that simply isn't the case. As people begin to disconnect from politics and take everything for granted like before, all the social progress and institutions necessary to uplift humanity begin to rot, just as gains made from the New Deal have been relentlessly undermined by reactionaries ever since the end of World War II. And now that the immediate apocalypse is over, nobody is willing to fight for a real revolution that would ensure nothing like this ever happens again. And this novel does gesture towards all those ideas, but Nick Fuller Googins wanted to have his cake and eat it too, present that cautionary tale alongside his dreams for what an eco-friendly future for humanity could look like, not understanding how one detracts from the other. Now, in spite of everything I've said, I do have a soft spot for utopian fiction. The aforementioned Kim Stanley Robinson published an essay I read a few years back called Dystopias Now. As the title suggests, it deals not only with the roles of dystopian and utopian fiction in our culture, but our shifting attitudes towards those ideas. Dystopias, he notes, more often tend towards the metaphorical lens offered by science fiction. They are grotesque magnifications of our modern anxieties. He specifically points to the Hunger Games as being, quote, not plausible, not even logistically possible. That's not what it's trying to do. What it does very well is to portray the feeling of the present for young people today, heightened by exaggeration to a kind of dream or nightmare. Yet he also notes how thoroughly our culture has digested these ideas. We can paint a million different pictures of how awful the world might be in the future, and I know you've got one in your head as well. Dystopia seems to be our destiny. Thus, Robinson writes, dystopia has done its job. It's old news now. Perhaps it's self-indulgence to stay stuck in that place anymore. Next thought, utopia. Realistic or not, and perhaps especially if not. Besides, it is realistic. Things could be better. The energy flows on this planet, and humanity's current technological expertise are together such that it's physically possible for us to construct a worldwide civilization, meaning a political order that provides adequate food, water, shelter, clothing, education, and healthcare for all 8 billion humans, while also protecting the livelihood of all the remaining mammals, birds, reptiles, insects, plants, and other life forms that we share and co-create this biosphere with. Obviously, there are complications, but these are just complications. They are not physical limitations we can't overcome. So, granting the complications and difficulties, the task at hand is to imagine ways forward to that better place. End quote. The Great Transition does a fantastic job of painting a dystopia I can believe in, and a terrible job of doing the same for its utopia. because that task Kim Stanley Robinson outlines is one I truly believe in. I probably wouldn't have bought a copy of The Great Transition if I didn't. It's why one of my all-time favorite books is Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, same as Nick Fuller Googins. It's probably my favorite depiction of anarchism, save for literal historical memoirs. The world of Anaris is beautiful and believable, and even though the story doesn't shy away from the potential pitfalls of such a society, it's not afraid to show you how it works and why it works. You don't have to take the story's word for anything. It has the confidence to explain itself, and does such a good job you come away thinking, yeah, maybe the world could eventually work like this. Despite that, The Dispossessed never fully resonated with me because of a plot point we discover towards the end of the book. It turns out Anaris was not fought for, it was handed over. The nascent revolutionary movement, fueled by the writings of its most prominent thought leader, manages to persuade the government into funding their lunar exile. The anarchists are granted passage to Anaris and allowed to rebuild society on their terms. This is described as a move made to excise these radical elements from society, to stave off a revolution, rather than one which grants said revolutionaries the means to further establish themselves and gather strength. That was the moment I stopped believing in Anaris. Though, to be fair, we are dealing with an entirely different species than our own. In fact, we actually learn what happens to humanity in this universe at the end of the book. We fail. We destroy everything, and never recover. A human ambassador speaks of Earth's destruction, and begs everyone not to repeat our mistakes. So maybe that is a world I can believe in. Because the human version of this story is one in which every last revolutionary and their families was shot and killed instead, as was the case in Ukraine, and in Paris, and Shanghai, in Catalonia, Czechoslovakia, Rojava, and so many others. So maybe The Dispossessed is a believable utopia, just not a believable utopia for humanity. That's really the word of the day, isn't it? I'll admit, I don't think I'm being very fair to this novel. I imagine most readers would probably be able to enjoy this for what it is. They could dip into this world, see the sights, drink in the ideas, and maybe come away heartened by the family drama at the story's core. Judging by the reviews, many have. But The Great Transition frustrates me because it presents itself as an answer to what will quite possibly be the most important question of our lifetimes. Not the answer, but an answer nonetheless. It taps into a very real and very potent anxiety, because humanity has never dealt with anything like this before, and the rest of my life, my friends' and family's lives, all of it will be at the mercy of that terrifying unknown. Though the picture gets clearer every day, every detail is inevitably more harrowing than the last, and I wanted to crack open this book and see in it a path forward for humanity that isn't so dystopian. Is that too much to ask from a novel? Yes, obviously, I'm entirely aware of that fact. But you know what? I don't care, because that's what I felt, and that's why I felt that way. I wanted to glimpse into a world where we overcame this seemingly insurmountable apocalypse, but The Great Transition only left me that much more certain that such a world is beyond our reach.